I woke up to the sound of engines. Not the helicopters or explosions that sometimes still haunt my nightmares, but something real and close by. I looked out the window and was frozen. 3 men in Residents Association uniforms were demolishing the garden I'd spent 6 months building. My refuge, my therapy. Coming back from Afghanistan was hard. The doctors call it PTSD. I call it my personal hell. Every single plant in that garden represented a day I chose to go on. A day when the voices were a little quieter, and now it was being torn out of the ground as if it meant nothing. I ran outside, still in my pajamas, screaming for them to stop. The team leader just pointed to a piece of paper. Violation notice. Signed by the HOA president, Sarah Williams. My whole body was trembling. This Sarah didn't even know my story. Didn't ask. She just decided that my therapeutic garden didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. Elizabeth Davis, my 78-year-old neighbor, came to help me. William, dear, take a deep breath. That woman has done this to all of us. For me, it was the rose bushes that my late husband planted. I went back inside, trying to slow my breathing like my therapist taught me. The military service medals hanging on my wall seemed to mock me. What kind of hero can't even protect his own garden? 3 years serving in conflict zones. I lost friends. I lost part of the hearing in my left ear. I gained nightmares, anxiety, and a pension that barely covers the bills. The garden was the only thing that kept me grounded. I looked at the photos on the shelf. A younger, confident me in uniform. Next to it, a more recent one, proudly holding a giant pumpkin I grew. Gardening became my salvation when the meds stopped being enough. Every seed planted was a promise for the future. Every harvest, a small victory. The psychologist at the VA hospital said that finding a purpose was crucial. Something that connects you to life, William. I found that in the soil, in the plants, in the cycle of caring and watching things grow. And now someone decided that my healing didn't match their aesthetic. I went back to the backyard after they left. The damage was worse than it looked. They hadn't just cut the plants, they had removed the special soil I had prepared, replacing it with standardized grass. My heirloom tomato plants, my medicinal teas, the aromatic herbs that helped me on sleepless nights. Everything was destroyed. Where my little meditation bench used to be, there was now just a rectangle of fake grass. I felt that familiar sense of despair rising in my chest, like on the worst days after coming home. James Anderson, the neighbor at the end of the street, stopped on the sidewalk. Man, I'm so sorry. They did the same to my deck last month. They said the wood I chose wasn't on the approved color palette. I noticed other neighbors watching discreetly, some with pity, others with fear. This wasn't the first time the HOA had attacked, I realized. The next day, I put on my only passable dress shirt and went to the Residents Association office. Sarah Williams was there, with perfectly done hair and a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Harrison, I understand your frustration, but the rules exist for a reason. Your project was lowering the value of all properties in the neighborhood. That garden was part of my medical treatment. I have documents from the VA hospital recommending therapeutic horticulture for veterans. She ran her fingers over the polished table. You should have requested prior approval with the proper documentation. And even so, there are aesthetic limitations to consider. When I mentioned that Elizabeth and others had also been targeted by arbitrary actions, Sarah visibly tensed up. Be careful with baseless accusations, Mr. Harrison. The HOA protects everyone's investment. If you can't follow simple rules, maybe this neighborhood isn't for you. That veiled threat lit something inside me. The same determination that kept me alive in hostile territory. I started documenting everything. I took photos of the destroyed garden, gathered receipts for the plants, copied the medical records recommending therapeutic gardening. Robert Wilson, a retired cop who lives 2 streets down, contacted me after hearing about the incident. William, this isn't just about plants. Sarah Williams has connections with a development company interested in this neighborhood. Every devalued property is an opportunity for them to buy cheap. Elizabeth introduced me to Jennifer Martinez, who worked as a secretary at the HOA. I can't speak openly, she whispered, but there are documents you should see. Secret meetings with investors, proposed zoning changes. I realized that my little garden was just the tip of a much bigger and darker iceberg. The copies of emails and minutes that Jennifer handed me revealed a disturbing pattern. Sarah Williams wasn't just an authoritarian community leader. She was the mastermind behind an elaborate scheme. The documents showed that she had bought her house in the neighborhood just 3 years ago, right when a developer called Phoenix Development started showing interest in the area. Look at this. Jennifer explained during our secret meeting at a cafe outside the neighborhood. Sarah gets commissions for each property that Phoenix buys below market value. The papers were shaking in my hands. The tactics were calculated. First, they identified vulnerable residents, elderly, low-income families, people like me struggling with health issues. Then, they created or arbitrarily changed the rules to target these properties. She has a list, William. People she deems easy targets. Jennifer looked genuinely scared. Your name was added after she found out about your PTSD. She thought you wouldn't have the energy to fight. I discovered that Sarah had a similar history in 2 other neighborhoods. In both, she served on the HOA board for a short time, followed by a wave of below-market home sales, and finally big revitalization projects run by Phoenix Development. Robert Wilson managed to get financial records through his police contacts. Check out these transfers, he pointed to a document. Right after a wave of violations and fines in the neighborhood, Sarah gets paid by a Phoenix subsidiary. She disguises it as consulting services. The most shocking discovery came from Elizabeth. She found her late husband mentioned in an email sent by Sarah. The Davis widow's garden has sentimental value. Once we hit that, she'll probably give up on staying in the neighborhood. I had to hold Elizabeth as she cried reading that. The case against Sarah was solidifying. James Anderson discovered suspicious changes in the HOA regulation code, changes that hadn't been properly voted on. Specific clauses were inserted to target certain properties, mine included. They created a rule specifically against therapeutic gardens 3 weeks before demolishing yours, James explained, showing me the altered documents. It's backdated, but the digital metadata doesn't lie. We organized our first meeting in Robert's garage. 15 neighbors showed up, all with similar stories of bullying by the HOA. They brought documents, receipts for absurd fines, violation notices for minor infractions like incorrect shades of paint or improper grass height. My daughter, who has special needs an access ramp, said Maria Gutierrez, holding the hand of the little girl in the wheelchair. The HOA denied it 6 times, citing aesthetic impact. Something shifted in me that night. Silence was no longer an option. We're not just fighting for our houses, I said, surprised by my own firmness. We're fighting for our dignity. We formed a group called Neighbors United for Justice. Every day, more people joined. A retired law professor offered legal guidance. A graphic designer created informational materials. Local teenagers distributed flyers. The local Veterans Association joined the fight when I shared my story. Their lawyer, Nathan Cooper, was particularly outraged. The destruction of your therapeutic garden is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, he explained. Veterans with PTSD are entitled to reasonable accommodations. The local press initially ignored our complaints until Jennifer risked her job by providing internal documents to Channel 7. The special report, Suburban Tyranny, went viral. Reporters started investigating the connections between Sarah Williams and Phoenix Development. We organized a community event called Restoration Day, where dozens of neighbors and volunteers brought plants to rebuild my garden. The image of wounded veterans, children, and elders planting together captured national attention. Sarah fought back with legal threats and increased fines. Some neighbors backed down, fearing retribution, but our core group stood strong. They're counting on our fear, said Elizabeth at a tense meeting after receiving an eviction notice. My Bernard faced the Normandy beaches. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by backing down now. The pressure mounted when we discovered unauthorized surveillance cameras installed by the HOA, monitoring coalition members' homes. Robert identified this as a clear invasion of privacy and secured a court order to have them removed. They're desperate, noted Nathan, and desperate people make mistakes. Nathan Cooper agreed to represent not only me, but our entire group of affected neighbors. His law firm dedicated substantial resources to what we now called a precedent for community protection. We're facing 3 battles at once, Nathan explained during our strategic meeting. First, a class action against the HOA for discriminatory practices. Second, a criminal investigation into financial manipulation and conflicts of interest. Third, a regulatory review of the association's own rules. Preparing the case took weeks of meticulous work. Every affected person documented their experience in sworn affidavits. Real estate appraisal experts confirmed the intentional devaluation of properties. A trauma-specialized psychiatrist testified about the devastating impact of destroying my therapeutic garden. I need you to be prepared, William, Nathan warned as we reviewed my statement. They're going to try to use your condition against you, suggesting emotional instability or exaggeration. He was right. The HOA's lawyers requested my complete medical records and tried to paint gardening as a hobby rather than legitimate treatment. They even called on testimony from former military colleagues about my conduct in stressful situations. But we weren't alone. The commander of my old unit traveled 300 miles to testify about my exemplary behavior. My VA therapist presented studies on the therapeutic benefits of horticulture for veterans. Elizabeth's granddaughter, a law student, spent nights researching legal precedents. The judicial discovery revealed even more incriminating emails. We found messages where Sarah instructed HOA employees to prioritize violations that encourage sales. Financial records showed that she had received over $200,000 in consulting bonuses directly related to Phoenix's home acquisitions. Jennifer risked everything by giving her official testimony. I was told to alter documents, backdate approvals, and create specific obstacles for certain property owners, she testified, visibly nervous but determined. The turning point came when Nathan discovered that Sarah's father was a senior executive at Phoenix Development. This conflict of interest had never been disclosed to HOA members, violating state transparency statutes. They offered a settlement, Nathan announced after a long meeting with the opposing legal team. $500,000 to be split among those affected, with a confidentiality agreement. I looked at Elizabeth, at Maria and her daughter, at everyone who had shared their stories. "It's not about the money," I replied. "If we accept it, this will happen again somewhere else. They'll just be more careful next time." The trial began on a cold October morning. The courtroom was packed, with neighborhood residents, journalists, representatives from veteran and senior rights organizations. Sarah Williams arrived impeccably dressed, accompanied by 3 corporate lawyers. Nathan opened with a powerful presentation. This case isn't just about neighborhood rules. It's about a calculated scheme to exploit vulnerabilities, destroy community spirit, and profit from other people's suffering. The first few days were dominated by technical issues. Interpretations of HOA bylaws, municipal regulations, zoning laws. Sarah's lawyers persistently argued that the board had broad authority to interpret and enforce rules as needed to preserve the community's aesthetic integrity and property values. My turn to testify came on the 4th day. When I took the stand, I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Sarah's lawyer started with aggressive questioning. "Mr. Harrison, isn't it true that your medical condition often impairs your judgment?" Nathan objected immediately, and the judge sustained the objection. "Mr. Harrison, you were aware of the HOA regulations when you bought your property, correct?" "Yes, the ones in place at that time, not the ones that were secretly created or altered afterwards." The lawyer showed photos of my garden. "Does this look like an organized garden to you, or a chaotic collection that undermines the neighborhood's aesthetic?" I took a deep breath. That was a therapeutic garden based on permaculture principles, recommended by trauma specialists. Every plant had a medicinal or nutritional purpose. The chaos you see is actually a carefully planned system that mimics natural patterns. Elizabeth testified about how the HOA had ordered the removal of the rose bushes planted by her late husband, causing her severe distress. Maria recounted the multiple denials for installing an accessibility ramp for her daughter. James presented evidence of how his deck was demolished without proper notice. Jennifer's testimony was crucial. Despite her visible nervousness, she stood her ground as she detailed how Sarah manipulated records, targeted punitive inspections, and coordinated actions with Phoenix Development. "Miss Martinez, why did you wait so long to report these activities?" questioned the defense lawyer. "Because I was scared. Sarah made it clear that anyone who challenged her would face consequences. I needed the support of this community to find the courage." On the 8th day, our team presented a digital forensic specialist who confirmed the retroactive alteration of HOA documents. A forensic accountant traced the flow of money between Phoenix and Sarah. Sarah's defense began to crumble when the judge allowed evidence of her previous schemes in other neighborhoods. Former HOA members testified about identical patterns of behavior. Sarah eventually took the stand, wearing a facade of professional indignation. "Every action taken was well within my authority, and for the benefit of the community." Nathan was ready. "Ms. Williams, can you explain why you received $78,500 from Phoenix Development 3 days after approving the demolition of Mr. Harrison's garden?" The room fell silent. Her face went pale. "Objection!" her lawyer shouted. "Speculation about the source of funds." "There's no speculation," Nathan replied calmly, presenting bank statements. "We have the transfer records. That was the moment everyone in the room realized we had won. The verdict came 2 weeks after the trial ended. Judge Anderson was categorical. This court finds substantial evidence of misconduct, fraud, and systematic discrimination by the HOA board, particularly its president, Sarah Williams. The sentence included the complete dissolution of the current HOA, financial restitution for all affected parties, and a referral for criminal investigation into Sarah's financial activities. She left the courtroom, avoiding reporters, escorted by her visibly frustrated lawyers. In the following weeks, the fallout spread quickly. The district attorney launched a formal investigation into the links between Sarah and Phoenix Development. 3 members of the HOA board made plea deals. Sarah was indicted for fraud, document manipulation, and extortion. Phoenix Development faced its own legal and PR nightmare. Their stock plummeted when investors discovered the extent of the scheme. The CEO resigned. Ongoing projects were halted pending an audit. The judge appointed an independent administrator to oversee the HOA's transition. New elections were scheduled, with transparent rules and mandatory participation from property owners with varied profiles, including seniors, families with children, people with disabilities, and veterans. The impact of our case spread beyond our neighborhood. State lawmakers proposed the Harrison-Davis Community Protection Act, establishing new transparency standards for homeowners associations, limiting discretionary powers, and ensuring specific protections for vulnerable groups. Nathan was invited to speak at legal conferences about the case. The precedent set here fundamentally shifts the balance of power between HOAs and property owners throughout the country, he explained in a TV interview. Associations now understand that there is real legal accountability for abusive practices. For me, the most significant victory came when the court ordered that the new administration not only allow the reconstruction of my therapeutic garden, but also provide resources to develop it as a pilot project for community healing spaces. Sarah Williams was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. The final irony: she was forced to sell her own house in the neighborhood to cover legal costs, and the new owner immediately planted a lush garden of native flowers. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to get access to more stories like this.